Eleanor Whitmore burned the letter before she finished reading it. Not from anger, from certainty. She already knew what it said. She had been sold dressed in silk, wrapped in contract language, and shipped west like freight nobody wanted to claim. But as the train pulled out of Boston and the city disappeared behind her, Eleanor did not weep. She opened her ledger, uncapped her pen, and began calculating exactly how long it would take to turn a failing Montana ranch into something no man could ever take from her again. If this story moves you, subscribe, follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train arrived 20 minutes late into Helena, and Jonathan Hayes considered that a bad omen. He stood on the platform with his hat pulled low and his jaw set like a man bracing for a blow he couldn't dodge. Around him, Helena moved the way it always did. Freight wagons, grinding through mud merchants, calling prices across storefronts, women in calico dresses steering children away from puddles. The whole town felt like motion. Jonathan felt like stone. He had not wanted to come. He had spent the better part of 2 days arguing himself out of it, standing at his own fence line in the pre-dawn dark, telling himself the whole thing was a mistake, that the letter had been misread, that Morrison men didn't collect debts like this, not with women, not with contracts signed half a decade ago, when Jonathan had been desperate enough to agree to anything. But the letter had been clear. His foreman, Pete Garland, had read it twice just to be sure. "She's coming Thursday," Pete had said, holding the paper like it might bite him. "June 15th. Train from Boston changing in Chicago. Boss, this is real." "I know it's real," Jonathan had said. "What are you gonna do?" Jonathan had taken the letter back, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest, where it had sat for 3 days like a coal ember that refused to cool. "I'm going to go get her," he said. "What else is there to do?" Now he stood on the platform and the train was hissing to a stop, and Jonathan Hayes, 45 years old, owner of the Hayes Ranch. 3,000 acres of Montana land that was quietly, systematically dying, waited to collect a woman he had never met, who had been promised to him in exchange for a loan he should never have taken. He told himself it didn't matter what she looked like. He told himself she was a business arrangement, nothing more, and that he would be civil and correct, and keep her out of his way, and eventually the Morrison family would see the marriage fulfilled and release the debt, and life would go on. He had survived worse. He had buried a wife. He had buried a son. He had buried a brother. Jonathan Hayes knew how to survive things. What he did not know, what he could not have known standing on that platform with his hat pulled low, was that Eleanor Whitmore was already studying him through the window of the train. She had been watching Helena for the last 20 minutes. Not the mountains, which were extraordinary, and not the sky, which was the kind of blue that Boston never produced. She had been watching the infrastructure, the road conditions, the freight weight on the wagons, the distance between the rail depot and the main commercial strip. She had been building a picture the way she always built pictures, from evidence outward, from data toward conclusion. And then she had seen the man on the platform. She knew it was him. Not from description. Charles Morrison had provided very little in the way of description, only the name and the address and the terms, but from the way the man stood. There was a particular posture that Eleanor had learned to recognize over 23 years of watching men in rooms they felt entitled to. It was the posture of someone accustomed to authority who was currently experiencing something they could not control. Jonathan Hayes stood like a man holding very still so nobody would see him flinch. Eleanor closed her ledger, set it in her bag, and straightened her coat. The woman who stepped off the train carried one trunk and a leather satchel that clinked faintly with the sound of brass buckles and glass ink bottles. She wore a charcoal traveling dress, practical rather than ornamental, with her dark hair pinned back in a style that suggested she had done it herself in poor light. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped conversation. She was precise. She was assembled. She looked like someone who had decided exactly who she was going to be and had dressed accordingly. Jonathan watched her scan the platform, and then her eyes found him, and she walked toward him with the directness of a woman who did not require introduction. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Not a question. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked at him the way a surveyor looks at land measuring, noting, reserving judgment. I have one trunk and this bag, she said. I don't require assistance with either, but if you have a man available for the trunk, it would save time. Jonathan blinked. He had prepared a number of responses for this moment. Polite ones, formal ones, the kind of words that acknowledged the awkwardness without surrendering to it. None of them fit what she had just said. I'll get the trunk, he said. Thank you. She adjusted the strap of her satchel. Before we go, there are several things I'd like to establish. He had already turned toward the luggage car. He turned back. Establish. Terms, she said. Expectations. I find that most difficulties between people arise from assumptions that were never examined. I prefer to examine them early. Jonathan stared at her. In 20 years of running a cattle ranch, he had negotiated with bankers and lawyers and land agents and cattle brokers and territorial officials, and not one of them had opened with the word terms while still standing on a train platform. All right, he said slowly. What terms? I understand this marriage is contractual, Eleanor said. I have no objection to that. I have reviewed the Morrison Agreement, and I find the language reasonably precise. What I want to know is what you expect of me on the ranch. I expect you to... He stopped. The honest answer was that he hadn't thought about it. He had thought about the debt, about the land, about the drought, about the cattle numbers dropping about the bank in Helena that was watching him the way hawks watched field mice. He had not thought about what he expected of a wife. I expect you to manage the household, he finally said. Cooking, maybe. Keeping things in order. Eleanor nodded once the way someone nods when they've confirmed a suspicion, and in exchange, she said, I expect access. Access to what? Your account books, your contracts, your land records, your correspondence with creditors. She met his eyes without wavering. All of it. The platform noise seemed to drop away for a moment. A porter walked past them with a dolly cart. A child shrieked somewhere near the depot doors. Jonathan heard none of it. Why? He said. Because I can help you, Eleanor said. Or I can make biscuits and stay out of your way, and in approximately 14 months you will lose this ranch to the bank. Your choice, Mr. Hayes. Jonathan looked at this woman he had known for less than 4 minutes. He looked at the way she stood, not aggressive, not challenging, but simply still like someone who had already thought through every response he might give, and had decided none of them frightened her. How do you know about the bank? He said. I read the Morrison correspondence, all of it, including the letters they didn't intend to share with me. She said it plainly. I'm very good at finding information that hasn't been offered. There was a long pause. I'll get your trunk, Jonathan Hayes said. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours, and Eleanor used most of them to ask questions. Not the questions Jonathan had expected. Not about the house, or the bedroom arrangements, or the town social calendar. She asked about water rights. She asked about his grazing rotation cycle. She asked whether the hay barn was positioned uphill or downhill from the primary water source. And when he said downhill, she went quiet in a way that told him she was already calculating something. Pete Garland drove the wagon and kept his eyes on the road and said nothing. But Jonathan could see the man's ears practically rotating backward, trying to catch every word. What's your current cattle count? Eleanor said. 412 head, Jonathan said. What was it 3 years ago? He didn't want to answer. 600. And your hay yield this season? Down 40%. From drought. From drought, he confirmed. She was writing in the ledger now, the book open across her knees, her handwriting small and even, despite the wagon's movement over rough road. Who holds your primary note? She said. Helena Territorial Bank, Calvin Marsh. Interest rate, 8%. She wrote that down. When is the next payment due? September 1st. Can you make it? The question landed flat and honest, and Jonathan heard Pete exhale sharply from the driver's bench. Not without selling cattle I can't afford to lose, Jonathan said. So, no. Eleanor nodded and kept writing. What are you writing? Jonathan said. A picture, she said, of where things are. And what does the picture look like? She turned a page, studied something, turned it back. It looks like a man who has been fighting a war on the wrong battlefield, she said. You're managing survival. You should be managing growth. Jonathan felt the irritation rise in his chest, the way it always did when someone who didn't know his land tried to explain it to him. He had built the Hayes Ranch from 40 acres of rocky hill country. He had run fence line in January blizzards. He had pulled calves in the dark with his bare hands. He had done all of this, and now a woman from Boston who had never seen a Montana winter in her life was sitting in his wagon with a ledger book telling him he was fighting the wrong war. You've been on Montana soil for approximately 3 hours, he said. 2 hours and 40 minutes, she corrected. And you believe you understand what I'm doing wrong. I believe I can see the numbers clearly, she said. Which is easier for me than for you, because I don't have the emotional attachment to them that you do. She paused. That's not a criticism. It's simply a fact. You built this. It's very difficult to see clearly what you've built when you're standing inside it. Jonathan turned to look at the mountains because he needed to look at something that wasn't her face. We'll talk about this when we get home, he said. Of course, Eleanor said, and went back to writing. The ranch house was not what she had expected. Eleanor had understood from the Morrison correspondence that the Hayes Ranch was struggling. She had prepared herself for a degree of neglect, peeling paint broken fixtures, the particular shabbiness of a place where money had stopped flowing. What she found instead was a house that had been maintained with fierce, almost stubborn pride. The porch boards were solid. The windows were clean. The kitchen stove was old but well tended. Someone had put flowers dried from last season, but arranged with care in a crockery jug on the table. She learned later that Pete Garland's wife Martha had put them there. Mrs. Garland comes by twice a week, Jonathan said, standing in the kitchen doorway while Eleanor set her satchel on the table. Helps with the cooking, the cleaning. You don't need to. I'm not here to cook, Eleanor said. Jonathan stopped. I'm not saying that with disrespect, she said, turning to face him. I'm saying it because it's important that we both understand what I'm actually able to contribute. I can cook adequately. I cannot cook better than Mrs. Garland can, I suspect, and it would be a poor use of both our resources to have me spend my hours on something someone else already does well. She held his gaze. I am very good with numbers, Mr. Hayes. I am very good with contracts and correspondence and identifying where money is being lost before it disappears entirely. That is what I can give this ranch. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Jonathan Hayes had been married before. Margaret had been a rancher's daughter, strong and practical and warm, in ways that the land itself seemed to reflect. She had died of fever when their son Thomas was 3 years old, and Thomas had died of fever 2 years after that, and Jonathan had buried them both in the hill behind the ranch house where he could see the graves from the east pasture fence. He had not thought about marrying again. He had not thought about another woman in this kitchen, in this house, speaking to him with that particular steadiness, as if nothing he said could surprise her. All right, he said. What do you need? The account books, Eleanor said. Tonight if possible. And a lamp with good oil. He brought her 3 years of ledgers, the deed records, the creditor correspondence, and the livestock insurance documents, and he left her at the kitchen table with a lamp and went to bed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he woke to the sound of her still moving papers. She found the first problem before breakfast. Your hay supplier, she said when Jonathan came into the kitchen at dawn to find her exactly where he had left her, the ledger open, her handwriting covering a separate sheet of paper in neat columns. Haskell Feed and Supply in Miles City. What about them? You're paying 17 cents per bale. The going rate in Helena for equivalent quality is 11 cents. She turned the paper so he could see the column. Over the last 3 years, that's a difference of approximately $420. Jonathan stared at the column. Haskell's been supplying this ranch for 9 years. I understand that, Eleanor said. Loyalty is a value, but $420 is also a value. And at the moment, you need the $420 more than you need to preserve a supply arrangement that doesn't serve you. She folded her hands on the table. That's one. Would you like to hear the others? How many others are there? She looked at her paper. 11 so far. I expect there are more once I work through the insurance documents. Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He was still in his work clothes from the morning's early chores, boots on, hat on the hook by the door, hands rough and red from cold water at the pump. Eleanor Whitmore was still in her traveling dress, and there was an ink stain on her left index finger, and she did not look like a woman who had been awake all night. She looked like a woman who was in the middle of something she found genuinely interesting. "Tell me the others," Jonathan said. She told him. By the time Pete Garland knocked at the door an hour later to discuss the morning work, Jonathan Hayes had a list of 11 inefficiencies in his ranch operation, totaling by Eleanor's calculation somewhere between $600 and $700 annually. Money that was being lost, not through disaster or drought, but through habit, through loyalty to old arrangements that had never been examined, through the particular blindness that came from running the same operation, the same way for the same years, until the way things were done felt identical to the way things had to be done. Pete looked at the papers spread across the kitchen table, then at Jonathan's face, then at Eleanor. "Morning," Pete said cautiously. "Good morning, Mr. Garland," Eleanor said. "Do you know a feed supplier in Billings? Someone who deals in volume contracts?" Pete blinked. "I know a couple. I'd like their names when you have a moment." She turned back to the ledger. "Also, when the ranch was last fully surveyed for water access rights. Do you know?" Pete looked at Jonathan. Jonathan gave him a look that said, "Just answer her." "Maybe 12 years back," Pete said. "Before the dry spell." Eleanor wrote something down. "We'll need to address that," she said almost to herself. "Water rights documentation is going to matter considerably when we talk to the bank." Pete Garland, who had worked for Jonathan Hayes for 11 years and had seen the man face down a bank representative without blinking and ride through a blizzard to find lost cattle and stand at 2 graves on a hill and hold himself together through sheer force of will, watched his employer's face in this moment and saw something he had not seen in a very long time. He looked like a man who was listening. The first real conflict came 3 days later. It did not come from outside. It came from the account books. Eleanor had found the Morrison loan documentation, not the summary Jonathan had been working from, but the original contract folded into the back of the 1879 ledger, where it had apparently been sitting untouched since the day Jonathan signed it. She read it twice. Then she came to find him in the barn. "You didn't read the full contract," she said. Jonathan was working a saddle, and he didn't look up. "I read enough of it." "You didn't read the collateral clause." That made him look up. "The Morrison family has a claim," Eleanor said, "not just on the outstanding loan amount, but on the eastern water rights to this property if the loan goes to default. 30 acres of eastern pasture and the creek access that goes with it." She let that land. "If you lose this to the bank in September, the Morrisons can take the water rights independently. They don't have to wait for the foreclosure." Jonathan set the saddle down slowly. "They sent you here," he said. "Yes. They sent you here knowing they had that clause." "Yes." "And you did, before you came." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," she said. "I found the clause in Boston in my uncle's correspondence 2 days before I left. I confirmed it last night." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you now." "Why?" Jonathan said. "If you're a Morrison instrument, why tell me?" "Because I'm not a Morrison instrument," Eleanor said, and the quietness of her voice was more forceful than anger would have been. "I am a woman they didn't know what to do with, so they shipped me west and hoped I would be too busy surviving to cause trouble. They underestimated both of us." She set the document on the saddle stand. "I am not here to serve the Morrisons, Mr. Hayes. I am here because I had nowhere else to go, and you had no one else to help you. Those are different things from what either of us was told." The barn was very still. Outside, one of the horses shifted in its stall. "What do we do about the clause?" Jonathan said finally. "We make the September payment," Eleanor said. "All of it." which means I need 3 weeks access to your full correspondence network and your trust. Jonathan looked at the document. He looked at the ink stain still on her finger from 3 nights of work at his kitchen table. He looked at the woman who had come off a train in a charcoal dress with a ledger book and had spent 72 hours dismantling the quiet disaster that he had been living inside for years without fully seeing it. "You have 3 weeks," he said, "and the trust." He picked up the saddle and turned back to work. "I'm still deciding on that," he said. But there was something in his voice, something that had not been there on the platform in Helena. Something that sat between reluctance and the first careful edge of respect that told Eleanor what she needed to know. She picked up the document and went back to the house. She had 3 weeks and 11 inefficiencies already identified and a water rights clause that the Morrison family believed was their weapon. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 23 years being underestimated by people who thought they understood her situation better than she did. She opened her ledger to a clean page, dipped her pen, and began to plan. Eleanor worked through the night again. Not because she had planned to. She had told herself firmly, the way she told herself most things, that she would stop at midnight, that sleep was a resource, and she could not afford to waste resources. But the Morrison Water Rights Clause had opened something in the ledger structure that she couldn't close once she'd seen it, the way a loose thread unravels faster, the more you understand where it leads. By 3 in the morning, she had moved from the kitchen table to the floor, papers arranged around her in a system that made sense only to her. The lamp turned high, her stockinged feet tucked beneath her, and her coat pulled over her shoulders against the cold that seeped through the floorboards. She heard Jonathan's boots on the stairs at 5. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't look up. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept 2 hours." On the floor, the table got crowded. She turned a page. "I found something." She heard him move to the stove, heard the scrape of the iron door, the sound of wood being added to the firebox. He did it without asking whether she wanted the fire built up. He just built it. Eleanor noted that about him, the way he responded to practical need without ceremony. "The Morrison Water Rights Clause isn't the only encumbrance on the deed," she said. "There's a prior claim filed in 1873 by a man named Gerald Crow, 40 feet of eastern creek bank. It predates the Morrison loan by 2 years. The sound of the stove door closing. Then silence. "That can't be right," Jonathan said. "I have the filing." She held up a paper without turning around. Territorial Land Records, October 1873. Gerald Crow. He claimed squatter's right on 40 feet of creek access before you completed the deed purchase. Your lawyer at the time either didn't catch it or didn't disclose it. Jonathan came around and took the paper from her hand. She heard him read it, not the sound of reading, but the quality of the silence that came from it. The particular tension that enters a man's breathing when he's looking at something that changes his understanding of what he owns. "Gerald Crow," he said quietly, "is Daniel Crow's father." Eleanor looked up then. "Who is Daniel Crow?" Jonathan's jaw was doing something complicated. "My neighbor," he said. "To the east. We've had disagreements about fence lines, about water access." He set the paper down. "Last spring he told me if I didn't sell him the eastern pasture, I'd regret it. I told him the eastern pasture wasn't for sale, and he could go straight to hell." "And then the drought got worse," Eleanor said. "And then the drought got worse." She looked at the paper, then at him. "He's been waiting," she said. "The filing is technically dormant. Squatter claims require active use to maintain standing, and Crow hasn't used that creek access in years. But if he chose to reactivate the claim at the same time, the Morrison loan defaults. He'd have a legal argument for access to the only reliable water on this property," Jonathan said. His voice had gone flat and careful the way a man's voice goes when he's putting things together he doesn't want to be putting together. "And Morrison knows that." "I believe Morrison and Crow have an arrangement," Eleanor said. "I can't prove it yet. But the timing of your loan, the collateral clause, the dormant land filing, these are not coincidences, Mr. Hayes. Someone designed this." Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat down. He put his forearms on the table and stared at the papers for a long time. How long have they been planning this? He said. I think, Eleanor said carefully, that the original loan in 1874 may have been the beginning of it. I think someone looked at your land at that creek access at the railroad survey maps for this part of Montana and decided the Hayes Ranch was more valuable than you knew. She paused. There's a railroad expansion corridor. I found the survey documentation in your county correspondence file. The proposed line runs within 8 miles of your eastern pasture. Land with water access along that corridor is worth more than I owe Morrison, Jonathan said. Considerably more. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, dawn was beginning, the kind of thin gray Montana dawn that comes slowly and without warmth. Jonathan sat with his forearms on the table and his eyes on the papers, and Eleanor watched him absorb it, the full shape of what had been done to him, the patient architecture of it, years in the making. She had expected anger. She had seen what anger looked like in men when they understood they had been deceived, the jaw, the hands, the noise of it. Jonathan Hayes didn't get loud. He got very, very still. All right, he said finally. What do we do? We need 3 things, Eleanor said. We need to invalidate the Crow land filing. We need to make the September payment in full. And we need to create a record of the railroad corridor value before Morrison realizes I've found it, because once he knows I've found it, the terms of everything change. She met his eyes. We have approximately 3 weeks before the September payment is due. We have maybe 10 days before someone tells Morrison that his new bride arrangement is going through his legal files. Who would tell him? Someone always tells, Eleanor said. That is the one thing I have learned to count on. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. There was something shifting in his expression, not softening, exactly more like the process of revision, the way a man looks when he is updating his understanding of a situation he thought he had already calculated. You said you suspected the Morrison clause before you came, he said. Yes. And you came anyway? Yes. Why? The question sat in the kitchen air between them, plain and direct, the way Jonathan Hayes seemed to ask everything without cushion, without approach, just the thing itself laid out for examination. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She had the answer. She had known the answer since Boston. But she had not expected to say it this soon to this man at 5 in the morning on a kitchen floor covered in territorial land documents. Because the alternative, she said, was staying in a house where I had already been decided about, where every room had a version of me that Charles Morrison had already written, and I was expected to inhabit it. She looked at the papers around her. I would rather build something difficult than maintain something comfortable that belongs to someone else's idea of who I am. Jonathan Hayes said nothing. He reached out and turned one of the ledger pages, studying a column she had marked. You're going to need the lawyer, he said, for the Crow filing. Do you have one you trust? I had one. He moved to Denver 2 years ago. A pause. There's a man named Samuel Birch in Helena. He's young. I don't know him well, but Pete says he's honest, which matters more to me than old. Can you get him here by Friday? I can try. Try hard, Eleanor said. We don't have room in this timeline for attempts. We need certainties. She began gathering the papers from the floor, ordering them with the efficiency of someone who had a filing system already built in her head. Also, your cattle broker. The arrangement you have with Morrison's purchasing agent. Jonathan stiffened. What about it? You've been selling your cattle to Morrison's broker at a below-market rate for 4 years. She found the page and set it in front of him. They've been reselling to the railroad supply contracts at a 50% markup. The stillness in Jonathan's face went another layer deeper. 50%, he said. Closer to 55 on the winter sales. He stood up from the table without a word, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her, one hand on the frame, looking out at the gray dawn coming over his land. I trusted that arrangement, he said. His father knew my father. I know, Eleanor said. That's how they build these things. They use what you trust. They use what you won't examine because examining it feels like disloyalty. She folded her hands on the table. You're not a fool, Mr. Hayes. You are a man who was specifically targeted because you're loyal, and you work hard, And you don't look for treachery in the people who've stood beside you. Those are not weaknesses. They are qualities that were exploited by people with fewer of them. He turned from the window. The expression on his face was something Eleanor couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude, wasn't softness, was more like a man recognizing something he'd been moving toward without knowing it was there. "You've been up all night," he said, "putting together the case against the people who sent you here." "Yes." "That doesn't bother you." "It clarifies things," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I'll ride to Helena and find Birch," he said. "I'll be back by evening." "Take the Crow filing and the Morrison collateral clause with you," Eleanor said. "And the railroad survey documentation. Birch will need to see the full picture." Jonathan took the papers she held out. At the door, he paused. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. It was the first time he had called her that. She felt it land differently than she had expected. "Yes," she said. "Don't let Pete Garland in those files while I'm gone." A pause. "Not because I don't trust Pete, because I need to be able to say honestly that only you and I have seen them." "Understood," she said. He left. Eleanor listened to his horse leave the yard, and then she turned back to the table and picked up her pen. She had 10 days. Samuel Birch was 28 years old and had a law office above a dry goods store in Helena that smelled permanently of turpentine and ambition. He arrived at the Hayes Ranch on Friday morning with a briefcase, an expression of careful professional neutrality, and eyes that took in everything and showed nothing. Eleanor respected that immediately. She had laid the documents on the kitchen table before he arrived, organized by type, then by date, with her summary notes attached to each cluster in her small, precise handwriting. When Birch came in and saw the arrangement, he stopped and looked at it for a moment, before he looked at her. "You prepared this," he said. "Yes." "Are you trained in law?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'm trained in numbers and correspondence. Law is adjacent to both." Birch set his briefcase down and looked at the table again. "Mr. Hayes said you'd been in Montana 8 days. 9, Eleanor said. "Sit down, Mr. Birch. I'll explain what we have and what we need." She explained it. All of it. The Morrison collateral clause. The Crow dormant. Filing the railroad corridor. Survey the cattle broker arrangement. The September payment deadline. Birch listened without interrupting, which in Eleanor's experience was the mark of someone who was actually thinking, rather than waiting to speak. He asked 3 questions, all precise. She answered all 3. When she finished, Birch sat back and was quiet for a moment. "The Crow filing," he said. "That's the key piece. If we can demonstrate abandonment of the squatter claim, active non-use for a continuous period. The territorial statute requires 7 years of documented non-use," Eleanor said. "I have 9 years of Hayes Ranch water usage records that show no access by the Crow operation at the Eastern Creek." Birch looked at her. "You found that in 9 days." "I had a good lamp." He almost smiled. It was a lawyerly, almost controlled professional, but there. "And the Morrison arrangement, the collateral clause. Is it enforceable?" Jonathan said from the doorway. He'd been leaning against the frame for the last 5 minutes, arms crossed, listening. Birch turned. "Potentially. It depends on whether the Morrison family can demonstrate that the loan was in default at the time they exercised the clause and the exact language of—" He turned back to the papers, found the document, read it again. Something crossed his face that lawyers try not to let cross their faces. "This clause," he said, "is conditional on the loan reaching default status before any partial payment is made." "Meaning," Eleanor said. "Meaning if you make even a partial payment before September 1st, the default trigger resets. The collateral clause can't be exercised in the same cycle." The kitchen went very quiet. "We don't have enough for full payment," Jonathan said. "You need partial," Birch said. $1 would legally reset the trigger, but a substantial partial payment would reset it more convincingly. Eleanor had already turned to a new page in her ledger. How much can we raise? She said to Jonathan. Not enough for full, Jonathan said. We sold 4 head last week, that's $80, Eleanor said. Plus the overcharge recovery if we terminate the Morrison broker arrangement and sell directly to Helena buyers. I've already written to 2 purchasing agents. Both responded. She looked up. If we act this week, we can have $140 by the 30th. Against a $900 payment, Jonathan said. Against a $900 payment, Eleanor agreed, but it resets the default trigger, and it buys us until January. She held his gaze. 1 season. I need 1 season to restructure the supply contracts and increase the herd return. If Birch files the Crow abandonment claim this week, and it holds, it'll hold, Birch said with the quiet certainty of a man who has read a filing and knows when the law is on his side. Then in January we make a full payment, Eleanor said, and Morrison loses the collateral window permanently. Jonathan stared at the table, at the papers, at the numbers Eleanor had written in columns that told a story he hadn't been able to see from inside it. This is your plan, he said. This is our plan, Eleanor said, if you agree to it. He was quiet for a long moment. Pete Garland appeared in the kitchen doorway behind him, caught Jonathan's eye, and silently held up a piece of paper, the morning cattle count, which had been short, 2 head, for 3 days running. Jonathan took the paper, looked at it, handed it back. 2 more head. Disappeared overnight. No predator sign. Eleanor watched his face. Crow, Jonathan said quietly. Probably, she said. He's taking my cattle while I'm in here working with lawyers. He's testing whether you'll react emotionally, Eleanor said. He wants you angry and distracted. He wants you to ride over there and confront him so that Morrison hears you're unstable and the bank hears there's conflict on the property. She set down her pen. If you ride over to the Crow Ranch today, you hand them exactly what they need. The muscle in Jonathan's jaw worked. How do you know that's what they want? He said. Because it's what I would do, Eleanor said, if I were trying to take something from someone who was smarter than they'd planned for, and I needed to make them stupid again. Birch looked at Eleanor over the table with the expression of a man who was rapidly revising his understanding of what he'd walked into. Jonathan Hayes stood in his kitchen doorway with the cattle count paper and 2 missing head and a scheme against him that had been running for years. And he looked at Eleanor Whitmore, who had come off a Boston train 9 days ago, and had spent those 9 days dismantling the architecture of his ruin. I won't ride to Crows, he said. Good, Eleanor said, but I want you to understand something. He stepped fully into the kitchen. This is my land. Every decision about what happens on it is mine. I'm listening to you. I'll keep listening. But this ranch is not a business arrangement to me. It's my family's graves on that hill, and 30 years of my hands in that dirt. He met her eyes. I need you to understand the difference. Eleanor held his gaze steadily. I do understand the difference, she said. That's exactly why I'm fighting this the way I am. Because you can't see clearly when it's your blood in the soil. That's not weakness. She paused. And I'm not trying to take this from you, Mr. Hayes. I'm trying to make sure no one else does. The room was very quiet. Birch cleared his throat gently. I'll file the Crow abandonment claim Monday morning, he said. I'd like to do it before any news of internal discussions here reaches Helena. File it Saturday, Eleanor said. Does the territorial office have Saturday hours? Birch blinked. The clerk owes me a favor. Collect it, Eleanor said. Jonathan looked at this woman in his kitchen, the ink on her fingers, the second night of sleeplessness around her eyes, the way she held the room with nothing but precision and certainty, and something shifted in his chest that he did not have language for yet. Pete, he said without turning around. Boss, Pete said from the doorway, move the eastern herd to the north pasture, tonight, quietly. Yes, sir. And add a night watch on the waterline. 2 men. Yes, sir. Jonathan picked up his hat. At the door he paused, and this time he looked at Eleanor directly. That plan of yours, he said, the 1-season restructure. Yes. Does it actually work? Eleanor looked at her ledger. At the numbers, she had spent 9 days building into a structure that she genuinely believed, could hold the weight of what needed to happen. "It works," she said, "if we both hold our positions and don't give them a reason to doubt us." Jonathan nodded once. It was not agreement exactly. It was the nod of a man who has decided to trust something he cannot yet fully see, which is a different and more costly thing. He walked out. Birch gathered his papers. Eleanor turned to a new page. Outside, she heard Pete Garland calling the night watch assignments across the yard, his voice cutting through the early afternoon in the particular way of a man who understood that things had changed and was moving accordingly. 2 cattle missing, a dormant land claim that was about to become very active in a courtroom, a railroad corridor that someone wanted badly enough to spend years engineering a rancher's quiet collapse. Eleanor wrote the date at the top of the new page. They had 10 days until the payment, 8 until Birch filed the claim, and somewhere between here and January, she needed to restructure the commercial relationships of a cattle operation, while its owner learned to let someone help him without it feeling like surrender. She was not afraid of any of those things. She had been afraid once of staying in Boston, of the room that had been decided for her, of the version of herself that Charles Morrison had been so certain was the only one that existed. She dipped her pen and wrote the first line of the January projection. That fear, at least, she had already left on the platform in Helena. Birch filed the abandonment claim on Saturday morning, and by Saturday afternoon, Daniel Crow knew about it. Eleanor had expected that. What she had not expected was how fast Crow moved. She was at the kitchen table working through the January projection numbers when Pete Garland came through the door without knocking, which he had never done before, and that alone told her something had broken the ordinary shape of the day. "Crow's at the east fence," Pete said, "with 4 men. Eleanor set down her pen. "Is Mr. Hayes with them?" "Not yet. Jonathan's in the north pasture. I sent a hand to find him." "How long have they been there?" 20 minutes. They ain't doing anything, just standing there." Pete's voice had the particular tightness of a man trying to present facts without the fear that was sitting underneath them. Mrs. Hayes. That kind of standing with 4 men that ain't a visit." Eleanor stood. She picked up her coat. "Don't send for Jonathan yet," she said. Pete stared at her. "Ma'am, if Jonathan rides to that fence line before we know what Crow wants, it becomes a confrontation. If I go first, it's a conversation." She buttoned her coat. "Where exactly is the east fence line relative to the creek access Crow filed on?" "Maybe 30 yards north of it." "So he's making a point about proximity without technically trespassing." "That's yes, ma'am. That's about the size of it." Eleanor picked up the copy of the Crow abandonment filing that Birch had left her. She had asked for 2 copies, specifically, and Birch had looked at her like he was beginning to understand that she asked for things specifically because she had already imagined needing them. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "Come with me," she said to Pete. "But stay 3 steps back." She walked to the east fence line with Pete Garland 3 steps behind her, and she felt the cold morning air against her face and thought very clearly that she was not afraid. She was interested. There was a difference, and it was a difference that had served her well for 23 years in rooms full of men who expected her to be the first one. Daniel Crow was not what she had pictured. She had built a version of him from Jonathan's description and from the land filing a man of patient malice, someone who played long games. She had imagined someone older, more contained. Crow was perhaps 35 broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from being the largest man in most rooms he entered. He watched her walk toward him with an expression that was almost amused. "Mrs. Hayes," he said when she was close enough. "I heard Hayes got himself a Boston wife. Didn't expect her to be the one coming to the fence." "Mr. Crow," Eleanor said, "I think you know why I'm here." "I know you had a lawyer file some papers." He leaned against the fence post, casual and deliberate. "Didn't figure they'd send the wife to talk about it." "Nobody sent me," Eleanor said. "I came because this is a conversation about documentation and legal standing, and those happen to be areas where I'm more useful than a confrontation would be." She held his gaze. "You know the filing won't hold. 9 years of non-use is 9 years of non-use regardless of what your father claimed in 1873. Something shifted in Crow's expression. The amusement didn't leave exactly, it recalibrated. "That filing is a matter of territorial record," he said. "So is the abandonment," Eleanor said. "Filed Saturday. Territorial Clerk's Office, Helena. It will be heard within 30 days and the outcome is not in question." She paused. "Which makes me wonder why you're standing at this fence line today, Mr. Crow. Because you're not here about the filing. You're here to see what Jonathan does when he's provoked. And since Jonathan isn't here, you're getting me instead." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm sorry if that's disappointing." One of the 4 men behind Crow shifted. Crow himself was very still. "You think you understand what's happening here," he said quietly. "I think I understand the railroad corridor survey," Eleanor said. "And I think I understand what that eastern pasture is worth to someone who has a prior agreement with a land acquisition agent working for the Northern Pacific." She watched his face. "How close am I?" The amusement was completely gone now. "You've been here 2 weeks," Crow said. 11 days, Eleanor said. I read quickly. The silence between them had weight. Then Crow straightened from the fence post and looked at her with something that was not anger. It was closer to the expression a chess player gets when the board has changed in a way they didn't anticipate. "Tell Hayes," he said, "that this isn't finished." "I'll tell him you came by," Eleanor said. That's all this was. Crow and his men turned and walked back across the boundary line. Eleanor stood at the fence until they were 100 yards out, and then she turned to Pete, who had gone the color of old chalk. "Go find Jonathan," she said, her voice completely even. "Tell him Crow visited, that it's handled, and that I need to speak with him before dinner." Pete opened his mouth, closed it, and went. Eleanor walked back to the kitchen and sat down at the table. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. That was good. She picked up her pen and found her place in the January projection and continued from exactly where she had stopped. Bad. Jonathan came in at a speed that was not quite running. "What happened?" he said. "Crow came to look at us," Eleanor said without looking up from the ledger. "He wanted to see how you'd react to the filing. I went out instead. You went to the fence line, alone. Pete was there." "Pete." Jonathan took his hat off and set it on the table with more force than was strictly necessary. "Eleanor, there were 4 men. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noted it the same way she noted everything quietly without display. There were 4 men who were not there to do anything," she said, looking up now. "They were there to provoke a reaction. Crow wanted you angry and visible before the abandonment hearing. I gave him nothing useful." She set her pen down. "I told him I knew about the railroad corridor and the Northern Pacific acquisition arrangement." Jonathan went very still. "You told him that?" "Yes." "We don't have proof of that arrangement yet." "No," Eleanor said. "But he doesn't know what we have and what we don't. And now he has to calculate whether to move forward assuming we have everything, or slow down and find out." She folded her hands. "I bought us time. Uncertainty is time." Jonathan stared at her for a long moment. The hat was still on the table. He hadn't picked it up. "You could have been wrong about what he'd do," he said. 4 men at a fence line, Eleanor. If you'd been wrong. "I'm rarely wrong about what men want from a situation," she said. "I've spent my entire life in rooms where men wanted things and couldn't say so directly. I've learned to read the gap between what they say and what they need." She looked at him steadily. "Crow needed a fight. I didn't give him one. He'll regroup and come at us differently, but we have the abandonment hearing first, and if Birch is right about the timeline—" "If Birch is right," Jonathan said. "He is," Eleanor said. "He's precise and he doesn't overstate. Those are the qualities that matter." A pause. "Sit down. There's something else I need to show you." He sat. She turned the ledger to face him. "The January projection," she said. Based on terminating the Morrison broker arrangement and selling direct to Helena buyers, plus the Billings feed contract Pete found, plus restructuring the herd rotation to free up the north pasture for winter grazing. She pointed to the column. We can meet the January payment in full with approximately $60 remaining. Jonathan looked at the numbers. $60 isn't much margin, he said. No, Eleanor agreed. But it's the difference between a margin and no margin, which is the difference between a functioning operation and one that's at the mercy of its creditors. She turned the page. There's a second projection here. If we sell the breeding stock from the Morrison broker arrangement, the 12 head he's been undervaluing directly to the railroad supply contract in Billings. The Morrison broker will find out. He'll find out after the sale is complete, Eleanor said, which is why we do it Thursday. Jonathan looked at the numbers again. He had the expression she'd come to recognize, the expression of a man recalculating, updating, revising the picture he'd been operating from. She had seen it on his face a dozen times in 11 days. Each time it appeared, it lasted a little less long. He was getting faster at integrating new information, which meant he was beginning to trust her math. Thursday, he said. I've already written to the Billings agent, Eleanor said. He'll have the pricing confirmation by Wednesday. Jonathan picked up his hat from the table and turned it in his hands. It was something he did when he was thinking. Eleanor had noticed that too. The hat as a thinking object, something for his hands while his mind worked. You went to that fence line, he said, not for the first time, but quieter now. Yes. I don't know what that took. He looked at her. I've been running this ranch for 30 years and I've faced down Crow twice, and it's never been easy. You walked out there on your 11th day. I had information, Eleanor said. Information makes most things less frightening than they look. That's not all it was, Jonathan said. She didn't answer that. Some things didn't need answering. She picked up her pen and turned back to the projection. Wednesday, she said. We'll have the Billings confirmation. Thursday we move the cattle. Friday Crow's people will hear about the sale, and by then it will be too late to interfere. She looked up. What I need from you between now and Wednesday is to keep operating as if nothing has changed. Normal movements, normal schedule. Don't change the eastern herd position that already tipped our hand to Crow, and if we move it again, he'll know we're nervous. We're not nervous, Jonathan said. No, Eleanor said, we're not. Something passed between them in that sentence, the shift from singular to plural, the word we, that was different now than it had been 11 days ago on a train platform. Jonathan put his hat back on and stood up. I'll tell Pete about Thursday, he said. Tell him Wednesday night, Eleanor said. The fewer hours it's known before it happens, the better. Jonathan nodded. At the door he paused. He was always pausing at the door, she had noticed, as if the leaving of a room required one more thing first. Eleanor, he said. Yes. Don't go to any more fence lines without telling me first. It was not a command. It was not quite a request. It was something between the thing that sits between authority and concern, when a person is still deciding which one it is. I'll tell you after, she said, when there's time. I'll tell you before when there isn't. A pause. That's the best I can offer. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked out, and Eleanor heard his boots cross the porch and descend, and she went back to the January projection, and the thing that had been sitting at the edge of her mind all afternoon. The thing she hadn't told Jonathan yet. The piece she needed to be more certain of before she said it out loud. Because the railroad corridor was real, and the Northern Pacific arrangement with Crow was real, she was almost certain. But there was a third thread she had found that morning, buried in a 4-year-old letter from Charles Morrison to the Helena Territorial Bank, a letter that should not have been in Jonathan's files at all, that had apparently been sent by mistake, tucked into a correspondence envelope with the deed payment confirmation from 1880. Morrison knew Calvin Marsh, not professionally, personally. The bank that held Jonathan's loan and the family that had engineered his financial situation were not on opposite sides of a table. They were at the same table. Eleanor stared at that letter for a long time before she put it with the others in the file that she was beginning to think of as the evidence file rather than the document file. She needed Birch to see it. She needed him to see it before the abandonment hearing, because if what she suspected was true, if the loan and the bank were coordinated, then the September payment and the January payment were not going to be enough. You could not pay your way out of a system that was designed to move the goal line each time you got close. She needed something more than payment. She needed exposure. She wrote Birch a letter that evening, short and precise, asking him to come to the ranch on Tuesday. She did not write what she had found. She wrote only, "There is a development. I need your eyes on before the hearing. It changes the shape of what we're doing." She sealed it, addressed it, and put it with the Morning Post. Then she went back to the projection and worked until midnight, and this time she stopped at midnight the way she had told herself she would, and she went upstairs and she lay in the dark in the room that was hers, the room Jonathan had given her, without comment, the room that had probably been a guest room or a storage room, or a room for someone he'd expected one day, and she stared at the ceiling and let herself feel for approximately 4 minutes. Everything she had been setting aside for 11 days. The strangeness of it, the sheer improbability of where she was and what she was doing, the letter she had burned on the train, the ledger she had opened instead of weeping, the fence line she had walked to this morning, and Crow's face when she said Northern Pacific and watched him understand that the woman they had shipped west like inconvenient freight had arrived already knowing the shape of what they'd built. She felt something that was not quite satisfaction. It was more like clarity. The sense of being exactly where her particular abilities were required in a situation that was serious enough to deserve her full attention. She had not felt that in Boston. She had not felt it anywhere until now. 4 minutes. Then she made herself sleep. Birch came Tuesday. He read the Morrison Marsh letter twice, set it down, and said nothing for 30 seconds, which was the longest 30 seconds Eleanor had sat through in recent memory. "This is conspiracy to defraud," he said. "I believe so," Eleanor said. "Is it provable?" "With this letter, and the loan documentation, and the collateral clause, yes." Birch's voice had gone to that careful register, the lawyer's voice that gets quieter as the stakes get higher. "This isn't a land dispute anymore, Mrs. Hayes. This is a federal matter. Morrison using a territorial bank officer to coordinate a fraudulent loan structure to acquire land with railroad corridor value that is mail fraud and conspiracy minimally. What do we do with it?" Jonathan said. He was at the table this time, had been from the beginning, and Eleanor noticed he was not turning his hat in his hands. He was very still. "We don't take it to Calvin Marsh," Birch said with the tone of a man explaining that you don't report a fire to the man holding the match. "We go over Marsh entirely, Federal Land Commissioner in Helena, and we do it before the abandonment hearing because once Crow's filing is dismissed and Morrison realizes the hearing has gone against them, they'll move to whatever their contingency is." "What's their contingency?" Jonathan said. "I don't know," Birch said. "But men who build something this carefully have a contingency." Eleanor had been very quiet during this exchange. Both men looked at her. "I know what the contingency is," she said. The kitchen went still. 3 weeks ago," she said. "Before I arrived, there was an offer on this property. A written offer." She looked at Jonathan. "Did you receive a letter from a land acquisition firm called Western Territorial Holdings in late May?" Jonathan frowned. "I got a letter. I didn't open it. There was a lot happening in May." "Where is it?" He looked uncertain. "In the office, maybe. In the pile by the—" "I need it," Eleanor said. He found it in 11 minutes, the letter still sealed, sitting under a harness catalog and a 2-month-old Helena newspaper. Eleanor opened it, read it, and set it on the table. "Western Territorial Holdings," she said, "is a Morrison company. They offered you 40 cents on the dollar for the property in May. If you had been in a different state of mind, if the drought had been worse, if the cattle losses had been higher, you might have opened this and considered it." She looked at Birch. "If the loan goes to default, I believe this offer will come again. Not 40 cents, maybe 50. Presented through a third party so Morrison's name isn't visible. Presented while the bank is applying default pressure and the Crow filing is still technically active. She paused. That's the contingency. They've been building the pressure until the number looks like relief. Birch sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. How did you see all of this? He said. I looked at it without caring about it yet, Eleanor said. When you don't have an attachment to the outcome, the structure is visible. Jonathan was looking at her. She could feel it, the particular quality of his attention, which she had come to know over 11 days as something different from how other men paid attention. Most men, when they looked at her, were deciding something about her. Jonathan lately was simply paying attention the way you pay attention to something that is continuing to surprise you. We go to the federal commissioner, Jonathan said. Yes, Birch said, but carefully. If Morrison hears we've filed before the document is in the commissioner's hands, they'll move to discredit the letter. Chain of custody matters. This letter cannot have passed through any hands that can be questioned. It's been in a pile under a harness catalog for 2 months, Jonathan said. That's actually helpful, Birch said. Unopened in the original location discovered in the presence of legal counsel. That's clean. He looked at Eleanor. You're certain this is a Morrison entity? The incorporation filing is a matter of territorial record, Eleanor said. Filed 1878 Helena. Charles Morrison is listed as principal with 2 nominee directors. It took me 40 minutes to find it in the county archives by mail. By mail, Birch repeated. I wrote to the Helena County Clerk's office on my 3rd day here, Eleanor said. I asked for a list of active territorial corporations with Morrison as a named officer or principal. She looked at him. I had suspicions when I left Boston. I confirmed them here. The silence that followed had a different quality than earlier silences. It was the silence of 2 men recalibrating the size of what they were dealing with. Jonathan put his hand flat on the table. Not a fist, not a grip, just his hand laid down. The way you lay down a tool when you've decided what you're building. File the federal complaint, he said to Birch. Thursday, after the cattle sale is complete. I want the financial picture as clean as possible before we put ourselves in front of a federal officer. Agreed, Birch said. And Birch. Jonathan looked at the lawyer with the directness that Eleanor had come to understand was simply how he communicated, no softening, no approach, just the thing itself. How exposed are we if Morrison finds out before Thursday? Birch was honest. Considerably, he said. They have more resources than we do. If they move before we file, they can create enough legal noise to delay the abandonment hearing, pressure the bank to accelerate the default timeline, and make the federal complaint look retaliatory rather than factual. He paused. Speed is everything now. Then we don't waste any more of it, Eleanor said, and reached for her pen. Birch left an hour later, with the Morrison letter in his briefcase, wrapped in a clean cloth to preserve it, and a copy of the Western Territorial Holdings offer and the names of every Morrison-connected entity Eleanor had found in 3 weeks of correspondence and county record research. Jonathan walked him to his horse. Eleanor stayed at the table. She was building the cattle sale documentation for Thursday, the direct contracts with the Billings agent, the termination notice for the Morrison broker that would be sent simultaneously with the sale completion, so there was no window to interfere. She heard Jonathan come back in. She did not hear him cross the kitchen, which was why she looked up when she realized he was standing directly across the table from her, and had been for a moment without speaking. What? She said. I keep trying to find the right thing to say to you, he said. And I can't find it. Eleanor set her pen down. Then don't find it, she said. We have work. I know we have work. He looked at his hands on the table edge. I had a lawyer once, good lawyer, older, careful man. He spent 6 months on a land dispute for me, and at the end he said he'd never met a cleaner case. You found the Morrison structure in 3 weeks. From inside a stranger's house in a state you'd never been to, working from files that weren't organized. He looked up. I want to say thank you, but that word isn't big enough for what you've done. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She had received gratitude before. She had received it in Boston occasionally when she'd solved something that the men around her couldn't, and it had always arrived with a particular flavor. The surprise in it, the way it held a faint note of inconvenience. As if being grateful to her required them to rearrange something they'd believed about what she was capable of. As if the gratitude cost something. Jonathan's did not have that flavor. "You gave me access," she said, "and time. And you didn't dismiss what I found because I was new or because it was uncomfortable." She held his gaze. "That's not nothing, Mr. Hayes. Most men wouldn't have." He didn't answer right away. The afternoon light was moving through the window behind him. Outside, she could hear Pete calling something across the yard. "Jonathan," he said. She looked at him. "My name," he said. "If you're going to keep saving this ranch, you should probably use my name." Eleanor picked up her pen. "Thursday, Jonathan," she said. "Then we can talk about names." And for the very first time, Jonathan Hayes smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind that a man produces when something has caught him entirely off guard and he hasn't had time to contain it. Eleanor looked back at the cattle sale documentation, but she felt it. She felt it the way you feel the first morning in a new place when the light is familiar from a window you've looked through before, even though you've never been there. The particular sense of something settling into a shape it was always meant to take. She did not show it. She had work to do, but she felt it. Thursday came in fast and cold. Pete had the 12 head of Morrison broker cattle sorted and counted by first light, and the Billings agent's confirmation had arrived Wednesday evening, exactly as Eleanor had projected. The price per head was 30% above what the Morrison arrangement had been paying. And when Jonathan read the number, he set the paper down and was quiet for a moment in the way of a man absorbing the cost of years of not knowing. Eleanor sent the termination notice to the Morrison broker by the same morning post that carried the sale completion documents to Billings. Simultaneous, the way she had planned it. By the time the broker understood what had happened, the cattle were sold, the money was in transit, and there was nothing left to interfere with. "Clean," Birch had said when Eleanor explained the sequencing to him on Tuesday. "That's very clean." It was clean because it had to be. Because the moment Morrison's network understood that the Hayes Ranch was no longer operating inside the system they had built around it, the response would not be slow or measured. Eleanor had planned for that too. What she had not planned for was the rider who came in from Helena at noon on Thursday. Pete saw him first from the barn, and something about the speed of the horse made Pete walk out to the yard before the man had dismounted. Eleanor was at the kitchen table. She heard Pete's voice, then a stranger's voice, then Pete's boots moving fast across the porch. He came through the door without knocking again. She was beginning to understand that Pete not knocking meant the shape of the day had changed. "Letter from Birch," Pete said. Ryder brought it urgent. Eleanor took it, opened it, read it. Birch's handwriting, which was normally precise and even, was slightly faster than usual, the handwriting of a man who had written quickly because the information could not wait. "Morrison has filed an injunction against the abandonment hearing. Judge Alderman, Helena District. Hearing postponed pending review. There is more. Morrison's attorney filed this morning with documents claiming the Hayes Ranch account books have been misrepresented to the court by an unqualified party. They are specifically naming you. I need to see you both today. Do not speak to anyone about the federal complaint filing until we meet. Burn this." Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Bad," Pete said. He had read it over her shoulder, which she did not hold against him. "Manageable," Eleanor said. She stood up. "Where is Jonathan?" "North pasture still. The cattle count's been off again this morning, 2 more head missing overnight. He rode out to check the line himself." "Get him," Eleanor said. "Right now." Pete went. Eleanor folded the letter. "Did not burn it. Burning evidence was something you did when the evidence was against you and this letter was not against them, and put it in the evidence file with everything else." Then she sat down and thought. Morrison had moved fast, faster than she had calculated, which meant he had someone watching the ranch, someone who had reported the Billings cattle sale quickly enough for Morrison to have a legal response filed by this morning. That was inside of 18 hours. That required either a prepared legal team on standby or a contact inside Helena who could expedite a filing. Or both. The injunction against the abandonment hearing was a delay tactic Birch would know that would tell them that. The hearing could be rescheduled. The legal grounds for the injunction were thin if the abandonment documentation was solid, which it was. But the secondary filing, the one naming Eleanor, specifically claiming misrepresentation by an unqualified party, that was not a delay tactic. That was personal. That was Morrison telling her he knew who had found the documents and that he intended to use her presence here, her lack of formal legal qualification, her status as a woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago and inserted herself into a legal dispute as the mechanism to discredit everything she had found. She had expected this. She had not expected it this fast. Jonathan came in 18 minutes later, coat still on, hat still on, the cold coming off him like he'd ridden hard. "Talk," he said. She told him. All of it precisely without softening. She watched his face move through the information the way she had learned to watch it the first stillness. The recalculation, the jaw, the hands. His hands this time went flat on the table and pressed down. "They're coming after you directly," he said. "Yes." "Because you found the letter." "Because I found everything," Eleanor said. "And because I'm the part of this they didn't plan for. The injunction is noise. The filing against me is the real move if they can establish that an unqualified party mishandled the documentary evidence. Birch can't use any of it in the federal complaint." "Can they do that?" "They can try," Eleanor said. "Which is why we need to get to Birch today and why I need you to understand something before we do." She met his eyes directly. "The filing calls me an unqualified party. In law, that's a specific term. I am not a lawyer. I am not a territorial officer. I am a woman who examined documents belonging to her husband's estate. The question of whether I had the standing to handle those documents is going to be contested." "They're your documents, too," Jonathan said. "You're my wife." In Montana, territorial law, a wife's right to independently handle marital property documentation is... She stopped. "It's not settled. It's not clean. A good lawyer for Morrison can make it a question." Jonathan was looking at her with an intensity that she felt the way you feel heat from a fire you're not standing close to. "You knew this was a vulnerability," he said. "Before today. I knew it was possible. Did you have a plan for it?" She was quiet for exactly 1 second. "I have the beginning of one." "Tell me." "I need Birch first," she said. "I need to know the exact language of the injunction and the filing before I can build around them." She stood, picked up her coat. "But the principle is this. If they are arguing, I had no standing to handle those documents, we need to establish standing in a form they cannot contest." She looked at him. "I need you to think about who you trust in Helena. Not Birch, someone who was there before Birch. Someone whose name means something to a district judge," Jonathan thought. "Walter Haynes," he said. "Retired. Was the county recorder for 12 years. He and my father were friends." "Does he know Morrison?" "Knows of him. I don't think they're connected." "Get a letter to him today," Eleanor said. "Don't explain the full situation. Just tell him we need his counsel and that it's time-sensitive." She put her coat on. "People trust Walter Haynes." "People trust Walter Haynes the way they trust the mountains," Jonathan said. "He's just there. He's always been there." "Good," Eleanor said. "That's exactly what we need." They rode to Helena together, which was not something they had done before, and the 2 hours were different from any 2 hours they had previously spent in proximity. The easy working silence of the kitchen table was not available on horseback on a road, when the thing they were riding toward was a legal attack specifically designed to dismantle everything they had built in 3 weeks. There was a different quality to the silence, tight like rope under load. Halfway there, Jonathan said, "Tell me about Boston." She looked at him. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "I know what you've built here. I don't know what you left." Eleanor considered this for a moment. She did not talk about Boston easily. Boston was the room she had left the version of herself she had refused to inhabit. Talking about it meant handling it again, which she generally preferred not to do. But Jonathan was asking directly the way he asked everything, and she had learned that he asked direct questions because he needed direct answers, and not for any other reason. "Charles Morrison is my mother's brother," she said. "When my father died 6 years ago, management of the family's financial accounts passed to my uncle by my mother's arrangement. I was 17. By the time I was 20, I had found 6 errors in the account management, not mistakes, deliberate redirections." She kept her voice even. "When I brought documentation of the errors to my uncle, he arranged for me to be sent to a women's educational institute in Connecticut for 2 years. For improvement, he said." She paused. "When I came back, I brought better documentation. That was when he decided I needed a husband in Montana." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "He was stealing from the family accounts." "Managing them creatively," Eleanor said, "to the benefit of Morrison interests." She looked at the road ahead. "My mother believes he is a good man. I love my mother very much. Those 2 facts have been the primary complication of my adult life." "You came here knowing he sent you to get you away from the accounts?" "Yes." "And you came anyway?" "I came," Eleanor said, "because the alternative was staying in a house where someone was stealing from my family, and I was not allowed to say so. And because—" She stopped. "Because what?" She was quiet for a moment. "The road was rough here, and the horses adjusted their pace without being asked. Because the documentation I found in my uncle's correspondence about your ranch told me that someone here was being cheated in the same way," she said. "And I thought that if I had to be sent somewhere, I would rather be sent somewhere where what I could do would matter." Jonathan did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Your uncle is going to be named in the federal complaint." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I know. And your mother's accounts will be part of the investigation." She said it without inflection, the way you say things you have already made peace with. "I've known that since I found the Morrison Marsh letter. My mother will be hurt. She will not understand. I have written her a letter explaining what I found and what I am doing. I sent it last week." "Has she replied?" "Not yet." The horses moved. The road moved under them. "Eleanor," Jonathan said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what you came from, and for what this is going to cost you." It was said simply, without the performance of sympathy, without the particular quality that sympathy sometimes had of making the speaker feel better rather than the recipient. It was just the truth of what it was offered, directly the way he offered everything. Eleanor looked at the road ahead. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Help me win." Birch met them at his office and had the injunction documents spread across his desk before they had their coats off. He looked like a man who had been awake since the letter he'd sent, which he probably had. "The injunction grounds are thin," he said immediately. "Judge Alderman is not a Morrison man. I know this because I clerked for a man who argued against Alderman twice and won. He rules on the law, not the room." He pointed to the document. "What Morrison's attorney has filed here requires them to prove the original abandonment filing contained fraudulent documentation. They can't prove that because it doesn't. The hearing will be delayed 30 days at most." "What about the filing against Eleanor?" Jonathan said. Birch's expression changed just slightly, but Eleanor read it. "That one is more serious," he said. "Not because they're right, but because the argument is constructed to take time. They're claiming the Hayes Ranch documentary evidence used to establish the Morrison-Marsh connection was handled by an individual with no legal standing to conduct discovery, and that chain of custody is therefore compromised." "She's my wife," Jonathan said. "It's our property." "Territorial marital property law gives a wife standing to manage household accounts," Birch said carefully. "The argument Morrison is making is that federal documentary evidence preparation is outside that standing." He looked at Eleanor. "It's a bad faith argument, and I believe I can defeat it. But I need time, and time is what they're buying." "Walter Haynes," Eleanor said. Birch looked at her. "What about him?" "Jonathan has written to him. If Haynes will attest to having directed Eleanor to examine those documents as a trusted local figure advising the family on the estate matter. Birch was already nodding slowly. A prior direction from a recognized county figure would establish the examination as conducted under appropriate guidance. He looked at Jonathan. "Will Haynes do it?" "If I ask him," Jonathan said. "Yes." "Ask him today," Birch said. "Tonight if possible." "There's something else," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She reached into her coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I found this morning before the rider came. I didn't have time to tell Jonathan before we left." She set it on Birch's desk. "It's a letter from Daniel Crow to Charles Morrison, dated 3 weeks before I arrived in Montana. I found it misfiled in the county recorder's correspondence archive. It was submitted with a land boundary inquiry and never separated from the public file." She looked at Birch. "In it, Crow confirms that the Eastern Pasture Acquisition Plan is proceeding, and that the quote marital arrangement should complete the financial pressure before winter." The office went completely silent. Birch picked up the letter. "Read it. Set it down with the care of a man handling something he knows is important." "They planned your marriage as part of the scheme," he said. "They planned to use my arrival as a distraction," Eleanor said. "They expected Jonathan to be dealing with a new wife, a household disruption, a personal adjustment. They expected that to reduce his attention to the financial situation during the critical period before the September payment." She paused. "They did not expect me to be useful." Jonathan was looking at the letter with an expression Eleanor had not seen on him before. It was not anger, it was past anger, in the place on the other side of it where things get very cold and very clear. "Morrison used you," Jonathan said quietly, "as a tool to distract me." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And it didn't work. Which is why they're moving now, because I'm a month ahead of where they thought I'd be, and the abandonment filing was not supposed to happen, and the billing sale was not supposed to happen, and the Morrison Marsh letter was absolutely not supposed to be found." She looked at him steadily. "They built this scheme for a version of me that stayed in the parlor and worried about curtains. That version would have given them until January without any trouble." Jonathan stood up from the chair he had taken. He walked to the window of Birch's office and stood there with his back to the room, and Eleanor let him stand there because she understood that he needed a moment to process not just what had been done to his ranch, but what had been done to her. "File the federal complaint today," Jonathan said, still facing the window. "Don't wait for Thursday, today." "Jonathan," Birch began. "Today," Jonathan said and turned around. His voice was controlled and completely flat, the voice of a man who has moved past the feeling into the decision. "Morrison is moving faster than we projected. Every hour we wait is an hour he has to build more obstacles. We have the letter. We have the Morrison Marsh connection. We have the land filing evidence and the cattle broker documentation." He looked at Birch. "What else do you need that you don't already have?" Birch looked at the papers on his desk. "Nothing," he said quietly. "I have everything." "Then file it." Birch reached for his coat. Eleanor was already organizing the documents in order the sequence she had built in her mind 3 days ago, the arrangement that told the story most clearly from the first Morrison loan to the Crow letter to the bank coordination. She set them on Birch's desk in that order, and Birch looked at the arrangement and then at her. "You had this sequence ready," he said. "I had it ready Sunday," Eleanor said. "I was waiting for the right moment." "What changed?" "They moved first," she said. "Which means the right moment is now." Birch left for the Federal Land Commissioner's office with a briefcase that held 3 years of Eleanor's work compressed into a sequence that could be read and understood and acted upon, and Jonathan and Eleanor sat in the outer office of Birch's building and waited. And the waiting was the hardest thing Eleanor had done in 3 weeks, because waiting required her to stop working, and she had not stopped working in 3 weeks. Jonathan sat beside her. Not close, there was a chair between them, but present in the particular way she had learned to feel his presence, the steady quality of it like a fence post that doesn't announce itself, but is simply solid when you put your weight against it. "Your mother's letter," he said. She looked at him. "When she replies," he said, "whatever she says, you have a place to be while you figure out what to do with it. You don't have to handle it somewhere else." Eleanor looked at her hands folded in her lap. She had been holding something back for 3 weeks. Not the work, not the planning, not the legal architecture or the evidence or the projections. Something quieter than all of that. The specific loneliness of being in a strange place, doing necessary things, without anyone who knew the full cost of them. Jonathan knew the cost now. She had told him on the road, and he had listened, and he had said, "I'm sorry," without making it about himself. And now he was telling her that the answer to her mother's letter, whatever it was, would be opened in a place that was becoming something she had not had in years. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He didn't comment on the quietness. He just nodded once, and they sat, and the clock on Birch's wall measured the hour. Birch came back 47 minutes later. He came through the door with his coat still on, and his briefcase in hand, and an expression that Eleanor read immediately, not relief, but the particular tightness of someone who has put something irreversible into motion. "It's filed," he said. "Federal Land Commissioner received it. He read the Morrison Marsh letter while I was there." Birch set his briefcase down. He said, and I am quoting precisely, that he had been waiting for someone to bring him something like this for 3 years. Jonathan looked up. 3 years. "There have been other ranches," Birch said. "Other loans. Other collateral arrangements. The commissioner has been watching the pattern without the evidence to act on it." He looked at Eleanor. "Your documentation doesn't just address the Hayes case. It gives him the connective tissue between 5 separate land acquisitions over 8 years." He paused. "The commissioner is sending a federal marshal to Helena by the end of the week. Morrison Marsh and Crow are all named in the complaint." The outer office was very quiet. Eleanor felt something move through her that she did not immediately identify, a loosening, a release of something she had been holding so carefully and for so long that she had stopped being aware of its weight. 3 weeks of precision and control, and the constant forward movement of someone who could not afford to stop, and now here was a federal commissioner in an office across Helena, holding the thing she had built and calling it sufficient. She breathed. Jonathan was watching her. He saw it, the loosening, the breath, and he said nothing, which was exactly right. "Morrison will know by tomorrow," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "When he knows, what does he do?" "He lawyers up," Birch said. "At that level of federal exposure, mail fraud, conspiracy, bank coordination, he cannot run, he can only contest. And the letter from Crow, the one in the public file, the one that was never supposed to be there." Birch shook his head. "That letter is going to be very difficult to explain away." "The abandonment hearing," Jonathan said. "His injunction." "Collapses," Birch said. "The federal complaint supersedes the district injunction. Judge Alderman will be notified as a matter of procedure." He looked at them both. "The Crow filing will be dismissed. The Morrison loan collateral clause is part of a fraudulent instrument. It cannot be enforced. Your September payment deadline will be stayed pending the federal investigation." He paused. "You're not going to lose this ranch, Mr. Hayes." Jonathan did not move for a long moment. Then he said, "The eastern pasture." "Protected?" Birch said. "The water rights, the creek access, all of it. The federal complaint establishes the entire eastern boundary claim as part of the fraudulent scheme." Jonathan picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He held it for a moment, looking at it, and then he set it on his head with the careful deliberateness of a man putting something back in its right place after it had been in danger of being lost. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him, and in that look was everything that had been built in 3 weeks: the nights at the kitchen table, the fence line in the morning cold, the rider at noon on Thursday, the road to Helena, and what had been said on it, the letter from her mother, not yet arrived. The evidence file she had built from a lamp, and 9 days, and a lifetime of being underestimated by people who thought they understood what she was. "Let's go home," Jonathan said. It was the first time he had said home in a way that included her in the word. Eleanor stood, picked up her coat, and walked out of Samuel Birch's office into the Helena afternoon with Jonathan Hayes beside her, and neither of them said anything on the way to the horses. But the silence was different now. Not the rope-underload silence of the ride in, but the silence of something that has been through tension and come out the other side, changed into a different kind of strength. The federal complaint was filed. The marshal was coming. The scheme that had been 8 years in the building was beginning in Helena to come apart. And somewhere in the Morrison family's Boston correspondence, Eleanor knew there was a letter from Charles Morrison to her uncle. A letter she had not yet found, but that she was now certain existed, that described exactly what they had planned to do with the inconvenient niece they had shipped west like freight nobody wanted. She was going to find that letter too. But first, she was going home. The ride back from Helena took 2 hours, and for the first hour, neither of them spoke. Not the silence of distance they had ridden close since leaving Birch's office. The horses settling naturally into the same pace, the way horses do when they've covered ground together before. It was the silence of people who have been through something and are still inside the shape of it, still feeling where it pressed and where it held. Pete was waiting in the yard when they arrived. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting in a yard for several hours and had rehearsed several versions of the question he wanted to ask. "Well," he said. "Federal complaint is filed," Jonathan said, dismounting. "Marshal comes end of the week." Pete stood very still for a moment. Then he took off his hat, looked at it, put it back on. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. "Get the hands together after supper," Jonathan said. "I want everyone to hear it from me directly before rumor beats me to it." "Yes, sir." Pete looked at Eleanor as she dismounted. Something in his expression had been changing for 3 weeks in the incremental way that a man revises a first impression he had formed before he had information. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "you eat anything today?" Eleanor thought about it. "Coffee," she said. "Martha left a pot of stew," Pete said. "I'll heat it." He went toward the kitchen with the purposeful movement of a man who needed to do something useful with his hands, and Eleanor understood that this was Pete Garland's version of thank you, and she received it accordingly. The letter from her mother arrived the following morning. Eleanor heard the post rider from the kitchen table, where she was already working. She was always already working. When sounds arrived from outside, and Jonathan had begun to navigate the house around this fact, the way you navigate around a piece of furniture that belongs exactly where it is. He brought her the letter without comment, set it beside her coffee cup, and went to the stove. She looked at the envelope for a moment before she opened it. Her mother's handwriting on the outside. Careful considered the penmanship of a woman who had been taught that how you wrote a letter said something about who you were. She opened it. She read it. Jonathan did not ask. He refilled his own coffee and sat down across from her with the cattle rotation schedule Pete had left yesterday, and read that and gave her the space to read the letter the way it needed to be read. Eleanor set it down after the second reading. "She believes him," Eleanor said. Jonathan looked up. "My mother," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. She was working very hard to keep it even, and the work of it was visible in the stillness of her face, in the way her hands were flat on the table. "She says I have always had an unfortunate tendency to see deception where there is none. She says Charles has been a devoted protector of the family interests, and that my accusations will cause irreparable harm to people who have done nothing to deserve it." She paused. "She asks me to consider whether my removal to Montana has caused me to develop an unbalanced view of things." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said. "She thinks I'm wrong," Eleanor said. "She has known Charles Morrison for 40 years, and she loves him, and she is not able to." She stopped. The evenness in her voice cracked slightly, just at the edge of the sentence, and she let it crack, and then steadied it. "She's not a foolish woman. She's a woman who built her safety around believing in a man who was stealing from her, and the alternative to believing in him is understanding that her safety was never real." Eleanor looked at the letter. "That is a very hard thing to ask someone to understand." Jonathan set down the rotation schedule. "You're not wrong," he said. "The federal complaint proves you're not wrong. And when the investigation concludes, your mother will have documentation that even Charles Morrison cannot explain away." He waited until she looked at him. "She may not thank you for it, but she'll have the truth. and the money he redirected the accounts, those can be recovered through the federal process. She won't see it that way initially, Eleanor said. No, Jonathan agreed. Initially, she'll probably be devastated, and then she'll be angry, and the anger will look for a place to land, and some of it will land on you because you're the one who moved the ground under her. He looked at her steadily. That's not justice. It's just how it goes sometimes, when you tell the truth about something someone needed to believe in. Eleanor looked at him, at this man who had buried a wife and a son and a brother, and had run a ranch alone for years, and had not, as far as she could tell, ever asked for credit for the endurance of any of it. You've been through something like this, she said. Different thing, he said. Same shape. She nodded. She folded her mother's letter and put it in her coat pocket. Not the evidence file, not the document stack, her pocket, where it was separate and personal, and hers to deal with in the private space that grief required. January projection, she said, reaching for her pen. Eleanor. She looked up. The projection will be there in 10 minutes, he said. Sit for a minute, or on. She sat. She did not pick up the pen. She let herself sit in the kitchen with the cold morning light and the stove heat, and Jonathan Hayes across the table, and she let the letter be what it was for a few minutes without moving past it. It was harder than 3 weeks of work. It was harder than Crow at the fence line, or Morrison's legal filing, or the writer at noon on Thursday. All of those things she had known how to meet. This one required a different kind of holding, the kind that had no strategy, and no resolution timeline, and no column she could write the answer into. Jonathan poured her more coffee without being asked. She drank it. After a few minutes, she picked up her pen, and he picked up the rotation schedule, and they worked. The federal marshal arrived on Friday. His name was Arthur Connell, and he was a compact, quiet man from the territorial office in Billings, who had the manner of someone who had seen enough in his career that very little surprised him and almost nothing impressed him. He sat at the Hayes Ranch kitchen table, the kitchen table that had become over 3 weeks the center of everything, and read through the evidence file that Eleanor had assembled, and his face showed nothing. He asked 12 questions. Eleanor answered 11 of them directly. The 12th, regarding the chain of custody of the Morrison-Marsh letter, she answered with the name Walter Haynes, who had come to the ranch on Wednesday evening at Jonathan's request, and had sat in this same kitchen and reviewed the documents and signed a statement attesting that he had directed Eleanor as a family advisor to conduct the examination of the Hayes Ranch documentary records. Walter Haynes was 71 years old and had the kind of face that territorial Montana produced in certain men, deeply lined, completely honest, the face of someone who had recorded too many deeds and witnessed too many signatures to have patience left for anything that wasn't straightforward. He had read the Morrison-Marsh letter, and then he had looked at Jonathan, and then he had looked at Eleanor, and he had said, "I knew your father Hayes. He built that ranch with the same hands that signed a bad loan because he trusted people who weren't worth trusting. Let's make sure that doesn't happen to you." He had signed the statement and shaken Eleanor's hand with both of his, and that was the first time since Boston that Eleanor had been thanked by someone who understood what she had actually done. Marshal Connell read Haynes's statement and said it with the others. "Morrison will be served notice by end of next week," he said. "Marsh at the bank simultaneously. We don't serve one before the other because they'll communicate and move assets." He looked at Jonathan. "Your September payment deadline is formally stayed. No action can be taken on the loan while the federal investigation is active." "And Crow," Jonathan said, "named in the complaint as a co-conspirator in the land acquisition scheme. His filing in the territorial abandonment case." Connell glanced at Birch, who was seated to Eleanor's left. "Will be flagged to Judge Alderman as part of a coordinated fraud. I'd expect it dismissed within 2 weeks." Birch nodded. "I'll file the motion Monday." Connell closed his briefcase. He looked at Eleanor with the careful, assessing look of a man who has been doing his job long enough to know when someone has done his job for him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "the documentary preparation here is the most thorough private evidence assembly I've encountered in 11 years of federal land cases." A pause. "Where did you study?" "I didn't," Eleanor said. I read carefully and I asked precise questions. Connell looked at her for a moment. "The commissioner sends his regards," he said. "He wanted me to tell you specifically that without the connective documentation across the 5 cases we would have had individual complaints without a pattern. The pattern is what makes this prosecutable." He stood, picked up his briefcase. "You built the pattern?" He left. The kitchen held the silence that comes after authority has spoken and gone. Pete, who had been standing in the doorway for the last 40 minutes, pretending to be interested in the porch post, came inside and sat down heavily in the chair Connell had vacated. 5 cases, Pete said. They did this to 5 ranches. At least 5, Eleanor said. Those are the ones the documentary record connected. There may be more. Pete looked at Jonathan. Jonathan was looking at the table at the space where the evidence file had been, which Connell had taken with him as the official federal record. "Those other ranchers," Pete said. "Did they lose their land?" 3 of them, Birch said quietly. 2 sold under pressure before default. 1 went to foreclosure in 1879. The kitchen was very still. "Names in the file," Jonathan said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "All 5 are in the complaint." Jonathan stood. He put on his hat. "Pete," he said, "I want the east fence line walked this afternoon. Every post, every wire. I want to know our boundary is clean before this week is out." "I'll do it myself," Pete said. Jonathan walked to the door, and then he stopped, and he turned around, and he looked at Eleanor across the kitchen, across the table that had been the center of 3 weeks of the most consequential work either of them had ever done, and he said, "Come walk it with me." It was not an order. It was not a request. It was an invitation offered simply by a man who had spent 30 years walking his land alone and was asking for the first time to walk it with someone. Eleanor capped her pen. "All right," she said. They walked the east fence line in the late afternoon, and Jonathan named the land as they went. Not the legal names, the personal ones, the names that don't appear on any deed. Here was where his father had put in the first fence post in 1861. Here was where the creek ran fastest in spring, where the ice went out first. Here was where he had found Thomas, age 2, sitting in the creek mud on a July afternoon, perfectly content, having wandered from the house while Margaret hung laundry. He had been so frightened finding the boy missing, and so relieved finding him happy in the mud that he had sat down in the creek bank himself, and laughed until he cried. Eleanor listened. She did not try to fill the spaces between the stories. She understood that she was being shown something that was not in any ledger, that had no documentary form, that could not be assembled into evidence or filed in a federal complaint. She was being shown why. Why 30 years of frozen fence line and drought and bad loans and solitary grief and fierce stubborn maintenance of a house that could have fallen into disrepair, but hadn't, because letting it fall would have been letting them go, letting the graves on the hill become just graves instead of the center of a life still being lived. "You kept the flowers," she said at one point. "The dried ones in the kitchen. Mrs. Garland puts them there. Every season," Jonathan said. "Margaret used to do it. Pete's wife started doing it after." He was quiet for a moment. "I never asked her to. She just did." "People do things like that," Eleanor said. "When they understand what something means to someone, they keep doing the things that honor it, even when the person who started it is gone." Jonathan looked at her. "You think like that," he said. "About people." "I've spent a lot of time watching people," she said, "understanding what they're doing underneath what they say they're doing." "Is that why you're good at finding deception?" "Partly," she said. "Mostly, I'm good at it because I've had a great deal of practice being underestimated. And being underestimated teaches you to watch very carefully because watching is the only tool you're allowed." They had reached the eastern boundary, the 30 yards above the creek. Access the 40 feet that Gerald Crow had claimed in 1873, and that Eleanor had spent 3 weeks legally burying. Jonathan stood at the fence and looked at the creek, and Eleanor stood beside him. "This is the piece they wanted," he said. "Yes. Railroad corridor runs 8 miles southeast from here," Eleanor said. The creek access makes this the most valuable water-adjacent land in the corridor. She looked at it. They chose the right piece of land to want. They just chose the wrong way to get it. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "What's it worth?" he said. "If we wanted to leverage it, not sell leverage, use the corridor value to build." Eleanor looked at him. This was new. This was not defense, not recovery, not preventing a loss. This was building forward. "Cattle supply contracts with the railroad directly," she said, and she felt the projection structure assembling itself in her mind the way it always did, the columns and the numbers and the logic of it falling into sequence. If the Northern Pacific is running a line within 8 miles, they need supply stations. Water access at this creek could support a holding operation for cattle being moved to rail. You'd need infrastructure, a loading facility, additional holding pasture. "Can we finance that?" he said. "Not through Helena Territorial Bank," she said. "Not Marsh, and not anyone Marsh is connected to. But there's a land development bank in Billings. I wrote to them last week about the corridor survey, just as an inquiry." She paused. "They wrote back yesterday." Jonathan turned to look at her. "I was going to tell you tonight," she said, after the marshal left and things were settled enough to think forward. She met his eyes. "They're interested. Not just interested, they asked for a proposal." The creek moved below them. The late afternoon was going gold at the edges, the way Montana autumn did, quickly, completely the kind of light that doesn't linger. "You wrote to them last week," Jonathan said. "While we were in the middle of the federal complaint and the injunction and Crow at the fence line and your mother's letter." "I wrote to them the same night I found the railroad corridor survey," Eleanor said. "That was day 3. I thought it was better to have the conversation than not have it in case we needed it." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. "Day 3, he said. "I work ahead," Eleanor said. "It's a habit." He laughed. It was the second time she had heard him laugh. The first had been 2 weeks ago, when Pete's horse had expressed a strong opinion about a garter snake in the barn, and Pete had expressed an equally strong opinion in return. And it was a real laugh, surprised out of him, full and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has remembered that the world contains things that are funny. "A proposal," he said. "What would it say?" "It would say," Eleanor said, "that the Hayes Ranch holds water-adjacent land in the Northern Pacific Corridor with clean title and federal documentation of boundary, and is seeking development capital for a railroad supply operation with a projected return of—" She calculated quickly, the numbers running the way they always ran, effortlessly, like water finding its level, 32% in the first 3 years based on current Northern Pacific supply pricing and regional cattle valuation. Jonathan looked at the creek, at the land, at the fence post that Gerald Crow's father had tried to claim 40 years ago, and that was, as of this week, unambiguously, federally, irrevocably his. "Write it," he said. "I'll have a draft by morning." Eleanor. She looked at him. He was looking at the creek, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face had the expression she had come to know best of all. The expression she had catalogued in 37 days, not the calculation face, not the recalibration face, not the anger-gone-cold face. The face from the day he'd said, "We're not nervous." The face from the morning she'd told him to sit, and she'd let herself feel the letter for 4 minutes. The face that was simply present, simply paying attention without deciding anything about her. "When I was standing on that platform in Helena," he said, "I thought the worst thing that had ever been done to me was being sent a wife, like a debt being collected." Eleanor waited. "I was wrong," he said. "About what the worst thing was." A pause. "I was wrong about a lot of things that day." "You were working with incomplete information," Eleanor said. "It's the most common cause of wrong conclusions." "Is that what you do?" he said. "When something matters to you, you make it into an information problem." She considered this. "Sometimes," she said, "when the feeling is too large to hold directly, it helps to find the edges of it, give it a structure." She looked at the creek. "My father used to say that the only difference between fear and preparation is what you do with the information you're afraid of." "Smart man," Jonathan said. "He was," Eleanor said. "He would have liked this land. Jonathan reached out and put his hand over hers on the fence post. Not a gesture of romance, or not only that, more the gesture of someone who has found solid ground after a long time on uncertain terrain and needs a moment to confirm it's real. His hand was rough and cold and entirely steady. Eleanor did not move her hand. They stood at the east fence line above the creek that 3 men had tried to take from him in 3 different ways over 8 years, and the late Montana light went gold around them, and neither of them spoke because the things that needed saying had either been said already or would wait until there was time to say them properly. The Morrison case broke in the Helena Courier 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning under a headline that used the words coordinated land fraud and federal investigation, and in the last paragraph quoted the federal land commissioner as saying that the evidentiary assembly in the Hayes case represented an exceptional example of private citizen documentation work. Martha Garland read the article aloud at the kitchen table while Pete ate his breakfast and Jonathan had his coffee, and Eleanor worked on the Billings Bank proposal, which was in its 4th draft and almost right. "It says here," Martha said with the satisfaction of a woman who had been worried about this household for 2 years. The investigation, which encompasses 5 separate land acquisition cases spanning 8 years, was initiated following documentary evidence assembled by Eleanor Hayes of the Hayes Ranch, whose analysis of territorial land records and private correspondence identified the coordinated scheme. Martha set the paper down. "Eleanor Hayes," she said, looking at Eleanor with an expression that combined approval with something approaching reverence. "That's you." "That's me," Eleanor said without looking up from the proposal. "You going to frame that?" Pete said. "I'm going to finish this proposal," Eleanor said. "Woman saves a ranch, and she's already on to the next thing." Pete said to Martha, shaking his head, and Martha said, "That's why she saved it." And Eleanor turned a page in her draft and said nothing, because they were both correct, and there was nothing useful to add. Jonathan read the article. He read it once, folded the paper, set it down. He did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "The other ranchers, the 5 cases, what happens to them?" "The federal process will review their cases individually," Eleanor said. "2 of the sales may be voidable if fraud is established as the instrument of sale. The foreclosure from 1879 is harder. Those legal mechanisms are more entrenched. But Birch is in contact with all 5 families. He went to see them last week." She looked up. He said one of the women, the widow from the 1879 foreclosure, cried for 20 minutes when he explained what had actually happened to her husband's land. She had believed for 6 years that her husband had simply failed. The kitchen was quiet. "He didn't fail," Jonathan said. "No," Eleanor said. "He was failed. There's a difference and it matters, and she knows it now." She turned back to the proposal. "That's not nothing." Jonathan was looking at her with the expression she no longer tried to categorize or contain. It was simply his expression. For her, the one that had been developing since the train platform in Helena, and had settled over 37 days, and a federal investigation, and a fence line at sunset, into something she recognized, even if she hadn't yet found the right word for it. "The proposal," he said. "4th draft." "Almost right," she said. "What's wrong with it?" "The return projection for year 2 is conservative," she said. "I keep defaulting to conservative because the situation has been precarious. But the situation isn't precarious anymore, and the Billings Bank is going to want to see confidence in the numbers, not just accuracy." She tapped the page. "I'm trying to give them both." Jonathan pulled the proposal toward him and read the year 2 column. He studied it for a moment. He was not a numbers man, and they both knew it, but he was a cattle man, and he understood the land, and in the 3 weeks since she had started showing him her projections, he had been developing the particular skill of seeing what the numbers were trying to say rather than simply reading the numbers themselves. "You've got the north pasture at 60% capacity," he said, "to be safe. North pasture ran at 80% before the drought hit," he said. "The drought broke in August. By year 2, you can run it at 75, maybe 80 again." He looked at her. "That changes your year 2 head count by 40 to 45 head, Eleanor said. She was already writing. "At Billings rail supply pricing, that's an additional," she calculated, $1,100 annually. Jonathan nodded. Put that in. That's less conservative. You said the situation isn't precarious anymore. She looked at him. You said it, he said. So write it down like it's true. Eleanor looked at the proposal for a moment. Then she crossed out the year 2 projection and rewrote it. The number was higher. It was honest, and it was higher, and it was the number that reflected where they actually were, rather than where they had been afraid they might end up. She set her pen down and looked at what she had written. That's the proposal, she said. Send it, Jonathan said. The Billings Bank replied in 11 days. They approved the development capital with terms that Birch reviewed and called favorable, and Walter Haynes reviewed and called the best loan terms he'd seen in 30 years of watching Montana ranchers borrow money. The infrastructure for the railroad supply operation would begin in spring. The North Pasture would be expanded. The loading facility site Eleanor had selected it 2 weeks before the approval arrived because she worked ahead. It was a habit sat 30 yards from the creek access that Daniel Crow had spent 8 years trying to claim. The day the approval arrived, Jonathan rode the eastern boundary alone in the morning, before Eleanor was awake or before he thought she was awake, and she watched him from the kitchen window because she'd been at the table since 4 and had heard him saddle the horse. He was out there for an hour. When he came back in, he poured coffee and sat across from her and said, "My father would have loved this." "Tell me about him," Eleanor said. He did, and she listened, the way she listened to everything completely without interruption, building the picture outward from the details. A man who had come to Montana with $40 and a belief that the land was worth what you put into it. Who had built the fence posts and sunk the well and marked the eastern boundary with stones placed by hand. Who had taught his son that the land didn't owe you anything, and that was exactly why it was worth everything. Jonathan talked for the long time. When he finished, Eleanor said, "He would have liked this, yes. He built something worth keeping." "We're keeping it," Jonathan said. "We are," Eleanor said. The proposal approval letter was on the table between them. Outside, Pete was starting the morning's work. She could hear his voice crossing the yard, heard one of the hands respond, heard the ordinary purposeful noise of a ranch that was not dying, that was not surviving, that was building. Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand. Not the fence post gesture this time, not the confirmation of solid ground, but the deliberate gesture of a man who has decided something and is stating it with his hands because some things are better stated that way. "There's something I need to say," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "I'm not good at the words for things that matter," he said. "I know that about myself. I've always been better at doing than saying, and most of my life that was enough because I was doing things alone." He looked at her hand in his. "But you came here, and you did things too, and the things you did saved this land, and the letters you wrote, and the files you built, and the fence line you walked. Those aren't things I can pay back or balance out. They're just things you did because you could, because you saw what was needed, and you didn't ask permission." He looked up. "And the woman who does that, who walks to a fence line with 4 men and holds her ground and stays up all night with a lamp and tells me the truth even when the truth is about your own family stealing from mine." He stopped, steadied. "I want you to know that I see that, all of it. Not as a business arrangement, not as a contract, as what it actually is." Eleanor was very still. "What is it?" she said quietly. "A life," he said. "If you want it to be." The kitchen was silent, except for the stove, and the sound of Pete's voice outside, and the morning beginning over the Hayes Ranch, in the particular way Montana mornings begin, completely without hesitation, as if the day has always intended to arrive. Eleanor looked at Jonathan Hayes, who had stood on a train platform 41 days ago preparing to receive a wife like a debt being collected, and had instead received something neither of them had been told to expect. Who had brought her the account books at midnight and the coffee in the morning, and had sat beside her in Birch's outer office and told her she had a place to be while she waited for her mother's letter. Who had laughed at the fence line and walked her the eastern boundary and read the year 2 projection and said, "Write it down like it's true." "I want it to be," she said. He did not let go of her hand. Outside, the Hayes Ranch went about its morning. The hands worked the north pasture. Pete Garland walked the fence line he had promised to walk. The creek ran clean along the eastern boundary, where no crow would ever set foot again. The dried flowers in the crockery jug on the kitchen shelf caught the morning light, put there by a woman who understood what it meant to keep honoring something that mattered. And at the kitchen table, that had been the center of everything, the evidence and the projections and the drafts and the letters and the 4 minutes of feeling things without moving past them. Eleanor Hayes and Jonathan Hayes sat with their hands together over a bank approval letter and the beginning of a proposal for what they were going to build next. They had not been sent to each other as rescue. They had not found each other through luck or fate or the softening mechanism of proximity. They had found each other through work, through the specific, serious, unglamorous work of two people who saw what needed doing and did it, and discovered in the doing that they were stronger together than either of them had been alone. That was not a small thing. In the long accounting of a life that was everything, the Hayes Ranch did not survive that year. It was rebuilt post by post, pasture by pasture, contract by contract into something that had not existed before, because Eleanor Whitmore had arrived in Montana with a ledger and a lamp, and the absolute refusal to be the version of herself that anyone else had written for her. And Jonathan Hayes had been smart enough and brave enough to let her.